Well, hey there today. This is Pastor Joe from Southwest Lutheran Church, and I'm here to share a good book with you today. This is Stride Toward Freedom by Martin Luther King Jr. Now, I'll say I read this book first a couple years ago, and before I had read it, I was never really a student of the American civil rights movement. I knew it had happened. I knew it was so significant. I knew some of the names of the most influential people in the movement and most significant events, things like that. But I never really got a sense of what it was like to actually participate in the civil rights movement. And so this book is Martin Luther King Jr.'s own memoir of what it was like to participate in the Montgomery bus boycott. Now, just some quick history if you don't know this already. In the early 1950s, the Montgomery bus lines required black people to sit in the rear of every bus. They had a separate section for themselves. And more than that, if the bus was full and a white person got on board and there were no other seats, they could come up to you if you were a black person and say, "I need your seat." And if you were black, you had to get up, you had to give them your seat. Even though you're already a paying customer, you'd already paid your fare, you had to get off the bus and you had to walk. Now, one day there was a woman named Rosa Parks who refused to give up her seat to a white person who wanted it. And for this, she was arrested and she was fined. And this was kind of the spark that prompted black community leaders to begin talking about a boycott, to protest and hopefully end this system of discrimination and segregation. And let me pause here really quick and say why I think this is such a valuable book for us to read today. That is because I think that one of the real difficulties for many Christians and many churches in America is that we've really been conditioned to think that seizing worldly power, and by that I mean political power, judicial power, we've really been conditioned to think that seizing worldly power is the only way to accomplish the goods that the church wants to pursue. Now, there's nothing wrong with using wise government to make things better in the world, but in a real way, I think that many Christians feel like they need to be in charge of the society, the culture, and the government in order to do things like love their neighbors, in order to do things like care for their communities, in order to practice their religious beliefs and things like that. Now, there's a problem with that. The big problem with that is the government's only real strength is strength of force. So in the end, if we are going to use governmental power to produce Christian goods, then that means we're going to do this by threatening people with fines and imprisonment, and actually, fining and imprisoning people. It means we're going to use force to do Christian things. And that's just not how Jesus calls us to love our neighbors and to be his people. What we see in the Montgomery bus boycott, though, is how black Christians in America have never really been in charge in the way that white Christians have been in charge of American society and culture for so long. And that means that these black churches and black Christians, they have a long experience of working outside formal structures of power and formal systems to affect positive change. And it surprised me just how Christian was this boycott. How influential, how important black churches were to the success of the Montgomery boycott. Black ministers spread the word and made sure everyone knew that the boycott was starting. Black churches served as meeting places and public forums. The boycott lasted a long time. It lasted more than a year, where you'd have to be walking in the rain and in the heat. And regular meetings in black churches served to help people stay motivated. And it helped keep people committed to nonviolence, which was such an important part of this movement, even when people would be arrested unjustly, or even when they'd be subject to violence when their homes and churches were bombed. Black churches also sponsored carpool vehicles for people who couldn't walk. They provided a carpool so that you could get a ride around town to and from work and where you needed to go. And this is one of the images that really stuck with me after my first reading of this book. The image of a car packed with people driving down the street, and the windows would be open and you'd hear hymns being sung out the windows of these cars because it was full of Christians who wanted to do some good. And so they were singing songs on their way to work or around town. It's such a cool image. This should give us confidence to know that we don't need to be in charge in order to do Christian things and to make a positive influence in the world, to live as the people of God. This really was a thoroughly Christian movement. And I'll say these black Christians, well, they could do what they did because they knew their faith taught the dignity and humanity of all people. They knew that Jesus had given them the command to love their neighbors as themselves. And because they knew that Jesus had promised them that whatever had happened, they were living in his grace and he would take care of them. I imagine this verse would have been close to mind very often. Luke 12:4. Even when it was difficult, Jesus had said, "Do not fear those who can kill the body, and after that, do no more." Listen to Jesus instead. So, if you want to read this classic today, what you'll see is a very real, a very human picture of what it looks like when Christians sacrifice in the name of a greater good, when Christians sacrifice for their convictions. And it was a sacrifice for Martin Luther King Jr. and all the other leaders of the boycott who faced harassment and arrest and even violence for their convictions. It was a sacrifice for all the ordinary people who took on the burden of walking many places in the heat and in the rain and all sorts of situations, walking many long miles. It was a sacrifice for people who took on the burden of supporting the carpool and giving to the success of the boycott. You know, doing good in this world will always be difficult, and it's always going to be opposed as well, because there's plenty of folks out there who just, they see the kingdom of God as a threat. And when people live in kingdom ways, they see it as a threat to their influence, to their power, or even to their profits. It's always going to be hard. But sacrifice and conviction by Christians makes a difference. So read this book and read other good stories of Christians who made sacrifices in the name of a greater good. Let them encourage you, let them inspire you, and let them remind you that Jesus is always faithful to care for his people. So, have you read this book? What do you think of it? Got any questions or thoughts you'd like to share? I'd love to hear all that down in the comments below. Until then, take care and God bless.